Well, good evening. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. I'm looking forward to our time together. If it's too loud, I'm sorry about that. There's no one up on the sound, so if they want to turn it down, then, well, maybe I'll just speak in a slightly calmer way, and then we'll be all right. Let's think about the subject of whether we can trust the Gospels. I want to look at a few lines of argument about trusting the Gospels. Firstly, that we know roughly when the Gospels were written. Secondly, that there's corroboration for what they say. Thirdly, that they say embarrassing things. And the fact that they say embarrassing things is a sign of their authenticity, because if you were trying to make a story credible, you wouldn't write the sort of thing that they wrote. Also, that they know the places they're writing about. They know some very specific details. We're going to look at how they contain patterns, which it would be really hard for anyone to forge, in terms of the references we're going to see to do with geography and places. We're going to look at manuscript evidence, and finally we're going to look at other Gospels. So it's those 7 lines of argument I want us to pursue, and we've got till, 10:30 is it? Yeah, okay, so we better begin. Let's begin with looking at knowing when the Gospels were written. Let's start with Matthew's Gospel. What we can say with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is if we can show that those Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and if we can show when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John lived, then we can know something about when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written as texts. So, for instance, if Matthew's Gospel really is by Matthew, who was a disciple of Jesus, then Matthew's Gospel can't be written beyond the lifetime of someone who could have been a disciple of Jesus. In other words, it has to be relatively close to the time. So I would say that with Matthew's Gospel, we actually have some great evidence that Matthew's Gospel is based on what Matthew wrote. There's a man called Papias, or Papias if you prefer, who wrote in the early 2nd century, who said, this text really does come from Matthew. Now that's really quite close to the time. When you look at how you know that an ancient classical work is by the classical author, often the person telling you who wrote the work is much, much further away. And yet with Matthew's Gospel, we've got this man, and also Irenaeus later in the 2nd century, both saying that it was written by Matthew. Now, according to the Gospels, Matthew is a tax collector. And it seems to me very interesting that when I look at Matthew's Gospel, there are more signs of him being interested in finance than any of the other Gospels. So, for instance, he's the only one who talks about how the people come and collect the temple tax. He's the one who has the parable of the talents. There is a parable about miners, which is a sort of money as well, in Luke. But he's the one who has the parable about paying the workers. He also has details about Judas being paid money. That's recorded on 2 separate occasions, and buying a field, and finally the bribe to the soldiers. So there's a little bit of internal evidence, if you like. The sort of writing is the sort of writing that could have been produced by a tax collector. Not a very strong sort of evidence, but it's reasonable enough to suppose that Matthew really did write Matthew. When we take Mark's Gospel, we have the interesting fact that if Mark weren't the name of someone supposed to have written a gospel, Mark would be a nobody, because, he would just be a minor character in the New Testament, a bit like Epaphroditus or something like that. In fact, Epaphroditus would be far better known than Mark, because Mark isn't said to be an eyewitness. So why would you ever write and say Mark wrote this gospel if he wasn't an eyewitness? It doesn't give it any credibility. So it's hard to come up with a reason why someone would fake and say a story was written by Mark when it wasn't. What's more, when we look at him in the New Testament, we find that he does some rather embarrassing things. We find that he abandoned Paul on a missionary journey. We find that there's an argument between Paul and Barnabas about whether to keep working with Mark. So again, if you're thinking of a figure to try and give a gospel credibility, why would you choose a nobody, and yet the one thing he's actually known for is abandoning the missionary team? That wouldn't be a very smart name to stick on the cover. Now, he's described as an assistant to Peter, and traditionally it's thought that the gospel was written in Rome. Again, that man Papias writes about how it was written in Rome. Well, do we have any evidence for that? He said that Mark wrote his gospel on the basis of information given to him by the Apostle Peter. So in other words, it does have a connection with the events, but it was written in Rome. Well, actually, when you look at the internal evidence of the gospel, you can see some signs of that. Let's take the language as an example. when we look in the gospel, we will see plenty of instances where he really does know original languages. We find that he knows plenty of Aramaic and Hebrew. If we just look at these phrases, when he says, he presents Jesus as saying to a little girl, Talitha Kum, or to a man who can't speak, Ephatha, these are genuine bits of language in Aramaic. Now, if I were living way, way off from where the Gospels are set, how would I know the dialect that they spoke in? This is authentic dialect, and knowing that people would say Hosanna at a particular time of year is a very specific sort of knowledge, and it's exactly the sort of knowledge which Mark's Gospel consistently shows. Knowing that people up in Galilee speak in a different way from down in Judea, and that's why they can hear the difference in Peter's accent. But it's not just that you've got all of those words. In a Gospel written in Greek, you have all of these Aramaic words. It's also that when we look at the same gospel, we can see it's actually got Latin words. So, for instance, when it sends, they send an executioner to execute John the Baptist, the word for executioner is speculator, which is a Latin word written out in Greek. They've got a Latin coin called the quadrans, which is mentioned in this gospel. And whereas the other gospels, when they talk about a centurion, use the Greek word for centurion, this gospel just simply puts the Latin word into Greek letters. So it's exactly the sort of thing that would be written in Rome and not elsewhere. There's even that interesting point in the gospel where it says that the man Simon of Cyrene, who's supposed to have carried Jesus' cross, was the father of Alexander and Rufus. And he's sort of writing as if you're expected to know who they were. Well, Rufus is a very good Latin name. In fact, there's someone in the epistle to the Romans called Rufus, may even be the same one. So in other words, when we look at just the internal signs of Mark's gospel, that's the sort of stuff it's quite difficult to fake. The knowledge of those different languages, it's exactly the sort of thing that you would have if it really were written the way the early tradition says it was written and not otherwise. With Luke's gospel, you also have the fact that if it weren't that his name was attached to Luke's gospel and to the book of Acts, Luke would be a total nobody. I mean, a person mentioned once or twice in the New Testament, not anyone significant. So again, why would I attach his name, given that he's not supposed to be an eyewitness? Why would I attach his name to the gospel if I were trying to make it look credible? It doesn't make it look credible. So in fact, we can say, what's the suspicion? Why not just accept that it genuinely is by Luke? Now, if it really is by Luke, one of the striking things we have is we know roughly when Luke must have lived, because the book of Luke and the book of Acts are really like part 1 and part 2 of a work. And in part 2, in the book of Acts, he accompanies Paul for certain sections of the journey. And we know when Paul was around because we know which governors he was interacting with. So it's happening in the 50s and so on. And at that time, Luke seems to be traveling with him. He describes really detailed journeys. The most detailed description we have of a ship's voyage is found in Acts chapter 27, and exactly what we have is the sort of thing you would have if he really does know what he's talking about. So I would say on the basis of this, it really does seem that this was a man who was active in his career in the 50s. So if Jesus was crucified and Christians believe raised again in the year 30 or the year 33. I think I argued for the year 33 a couple of years ago, and I still believe that. But let's say 30 or 33, because those are the two numbers which are commonly used. Here we got someone who's active in their career, maybe 20 years later, so that means they're not going to be writing their gospel another 60 years later than that. In other words, we know that these things have to be reasonably early. And then we can also say that according to Colossians, he's a doctor, and there are signs. It's been argued by a man called Hobart, Hobart, was arguing that there are signs of medical language in Luke's gospel. It's also dedicated to a high-ranking Roman. It's dedicated to the most excellent Theophilus. Now, when you say most excellent before someone's title, that actually tells you the person's rank. Now, although we don't have independent records about the man Theophilus, it's likely, I think you can make a good argument, that he really did exist. Firstly, if he didn't exist, it would look pretty stupid if you dedicated a book to him and people said, that person doesn't exist. And if you dedicate a book to him, then he presumably knows the author and can check things out. So when you put these things together, it looks like a combination of things that's very hard to forge. To get people to accept a book as coming from Luke when Luke didn't really write it and dedicate to a high-ranking Roman, it just doesn't make sense to say it's a forgery. Then let's look at John's Gospel. John's Gospel has even more evidence for it being by John than the other three Gospels, because it actually has the best evidence that it is by the author it says it is, far better than almost any classical work. Because there's a man 2 generations after John, a man called Irenaeus, who was a disciple of a man called Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. So Irenaeus is 2 steps away from John. And Irenaeus has a copy of John's Gospel in front of him, and he reads it out, and he says, "These words were written by John the Apostle." Now, often when you're dealing with a classical work, the reason you think that Plato wrote a particular work is because someone has given you a list in one manuscript of lots of works that Plato wrote, and then you find another manuscript which actually contains a work with a title at the top which matches that one. It's not that you've actually got someone who reads out a section of the manuscript who's just a couple of steps away from them and says, yes, this person who I've heard about independently really did write this sort of work. So in other words, with all of the classical works that we say were written by various people, there's far more evidence that John was written by John the Apostle. That's one argument. With all of those things, it's that we can say roughly when the Gospels were written. They were written essentially in the first generation. People put different numbers on the years when Gospels were written, whether they were written in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or whatever. I'm not so interested in the numbers you put on them as so much as that they are first generation documents. The next argument I want to look at is just the embarrassment of the Gospels. When you look at the Gospels, they really aren't good PR for Christianity. When you think about what's at the center of their message, the central thing in the Gospels is that Jesus Christ died on the cross. Now, that is just not a good selling point, because the cross is crucifixion is how the Romans show they're in charge and whoever is being crucified is a loser. So to have as the center point of your message a man who has been publicly displayed to be a loser, that isn't a very good selling point. You know, any PR consulting firm would tell them, you need to sort of de-emphasize that or, cut it out entirely. They wouldn't have this as actually the main point. And then we think about the resurrection. Actually, the resurrection was a really embarrassing thing, because in Roman times, people didn't believe the resurrection was possible. It was simply insane, or even desirable, because what you really wanted is that after you died, you'd go to some sort of bodiless realm of mind or spirit, but to come back physically again was pretty disgusting. People didn't believe that other than Jews. So that's not a very cool point to have in the Gospels. Then we have the witness about the Gospel in the Gospels about human nature. That they aren't flattering about human nature at all. It's not the sort of message that people want to receive, and yet the Gospels are full of indications about just how evil humans are. And then a fourth point we could say about the Gospels is just how Jewish they are. Now, one of the things we know is that Christianity began in the cradle of Judaism. There were lots of Jews early on, and then it really took off amongst Gentiles really, really quickly. Now, once you've got lots of Gentiles in the church, how much are they going to like things to be Jewish? If you want to make things palatable to them, aren't you going to make them less Jewish? And yet the more you look at the four Gospels, the more you will see they are portraying a really Jewish picture of life and a Jewish picture of Jesus. Well, those are just a few embarrassing things, but think about these. The things that Jesus says in the Gospels, some of which are really embarrassing. Like when he says in Matthew's Gospel, to do what the Pharisees say. Well, why would anyone producing a document for the early Christian church say that? That doesn't seem like a very cool thing to say. Or why would you portray the leader of the cause as dying, saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? That looks like a loser speaking, doesn't it? So why would you put that in if it wasn't actually what he said? Why would you put in the saying where Jesus, when approached by a Gentile woman for help, says it's not right to take what's from the children and give it to the dogs, calling the Gentiles dogs? That isn't good PR with Gentiles. If you do your market research on Gentiles and find out how they respond to being called dogs, you'll find they generally are somewhat offended. So, that's not very likely to commend yourself. Or when Jesus, in a parable, tells people to imitate an unfair steward. Or when he says that his soul is troubled. And those are just a few of the things. But think about the actions as well. The disciples are constantly arguing about who's the greatest of them. The most eminent of the disciples, Peter, denied Jesus 3 times. Jesus overturns the tables. We get James and John asking if they can have a really prominent place, and all the disciples getting angry with them. They all abandon Jesus. It's just not very cool. And yet this is what you find throughout the Gospels. By the way, you can also make this an argument for the reliability of the Old Testament. What national literature do you know in the world that says so much negative about the people group from which it originates as the Jewish national literature, which is the Old Testament? Again, why would you put it like that? You're not putting it like that because you're trying to persuade people. You're putting it like that because you're really being honest. So when we look at these things, we can say we've got more reasons to believe. But I want to give you another argument related under this heading. And why did I put dissimilarity under this heading? Because I didn't know where else to put it. So I put it under embarrassment. But it's a bit different. And it is like this. That what we find in the Gospels is that Jesus' favorite way of speaking is in parables. And in doing that, in speaking in parables, he's doing something different from other people. Let's think about people before him. In the Old Testament, there are hardly any parables. There's a couple in the book of 2 Samuel. Nathan the prophet tells David a parable after he's committed adultery. We have a wise woman of Tekoa a couple of chapters later telling a parable to David. But on the whole, people don't have parables. In the Apocrypha, there aren't any. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there aren't any. And rabbis of Jesus' time do tell 1 or 2 parables, but no rabbi has a load of parables that he uses. So that's how the way Jesus is reported as speaking is different from all of the people before and around him. But we can also say that he's different from the people after him. The early church hardly used parables at all. So if Jesus didn't say the parables, it was the early church that put the parables on his lips. The strange thing is you'd be saying that they used parables to attribute to Jesus, even though no one else did round the time, and they never used them for themselves. That doesn't make a lot of sense. The most sense is simply to say that the portrayal you have of Jesus is dissimilar from people before and people afterwards because it really is the way Jesus spoke. And there's a further feature that you can tie up with this, and that is that Jesus, when he's in the parables, usually refers to himself, his favorite self-designation is calling himself the Son of Man. Now, Jews before Jesus didn't talk about the Son of Man very much. There's a little bit in Daniel, and in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel is called Son of Man. And the early Christians, when Christianity spread, would talk about Jesus as Son of God. They didn't often talk about him as Son of Man. So you've got a couple of characteristics, things that really are different in the parables, the way Jesus speaks in parables and the way he refers to himself as Son of Man, that really make them stand out from anything later. You see, if I were going to make up the way Jesus spoke, why wouldn't I make him say the sort of things that would be really useful for the church to know, like how to run a church service? Wouldn't it be great to have some words from Jesus on how to run a church service? Or what to do with all those Gentile dogs? Wouldn't it be really nice to have something from Jesus about what to do with these Gentiles? But nothing. So it's not the sort of thing that people would make up. If they were going to make it up, they would make up something completely different. So they're my first 2 arguments. Let's come to another argument. This argument is really that things in the Gospels are sometimes corroborated. That is, there's external evidence for them. And I want us just to think about a set of things that are said by a man called Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian born around the year 37, so after Christianity began, but not long afterwards, died around the year 100. And he wrote about what happened at a time when Herod's army, and I know there are lots of Herods, but this is the Herod you find in the Gospels at the time of John the Baptist. This is the Herod who put John the Baptist to death. And he writes about how this Herod's army was defeated. And I want us to read what he says. Now, some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God as a just punishment for what he had done to John, who was called the Baptist. So it's very nice. We've got Josephus talks about John the Baptist. So that gives you a bit of corroboration of the New Testament. This guy really did exist. For Herod killed him, just as the New Testament says. Though he was a good man and commanded the Jews to practice virtue, showing righteousness towards one another and piety towards God, and to come together for baptism. So that's his first thing he says, and he actually confirms several things in the New Testament. The baptism, it says, would be acceptable to him if they were not using it to put away sins, but for the purification of the body when the soul had already been purified beforehand by righteousness. Now that's a bit complicated, but let me explain it. He was saying the baptism isn't to get rid of your sins. You have to do the purification first, and then the baptism as a sign of the purification. Well, blow me down if that isn't another way of saying repent and be baptized. You see, the repentance bit, the change bit comes first, and then the baptism afterwards. Well, that is what Josephus is saying in a slightly more convoluted way just there. Now, when others came crowding round, and of course, the Gospels talk about the big crowds there are with John the Baptist, for they were very pleased by hearing his words. Herod was afraid that the great influence John had over the people might lead to a rebellion, since they seemed ready to do whatever he advised. And, of course, the Gospels do record how soldiers were coming and asking for advice from John the Baptist. He really is seen as someone who's giving lots of advice to people. So Herod says, Josephus says, Herod thought it far better to take him and kill him before any trouble came from him than to have regrets if trouble arose. So through Herod's suspicion, he was sent as a prisoner to Machaerus, the aforementioned castle, and was killed there. Now, what we've got that really fits in with the Gospels is we've got a sequence of things. We've got a sequence where John the Baptist preaches, he's then imprisoned, and he's executed. Well, I'm afraid, of course, that's a logical sequence. It can't really go in the reverse order. So no particular points there. But the same person is responsible for the execution. And in fact, it's Herod is described by Josephus as being afraid. Well, that's exactly what I get in Mark chapter 6, verse 20, that Herod was afraid. The same thing that we have about the authoritative teaching, the baptism, it's the same as we have in the New Testament. So we can actually say there's a lot of corroboration there, but there's a more subtle form of corroboration, which goes right to the heart of things. You see, what happens is when we read Josephus gives us a whole background. Why would anyone think that God was punishing Herod when Herod lost his army? Well, it goes like this, and it's a bit of a complicated marriage scenario. Herod had married and then divorced Phasaelis. I know many of you wouldn't have heard of Phasaelis before, but it'd be a great name for your dog. And she was the daughter of the neighboring king Aretas of the Nabateans. He's actually someone who's mentioned in 2 Corinthians. So he married the king's daughter and then divorced her. That tends to upset kings. By the way, if you're ever thinking, don't want to get into divorce counseling here, but if you're going to marry the daughter of a king and then divorce her, that tends to upset the king, just so you know for future reference. And then he had married Herodias, the wife of his half-brother Philip. So that's what we're told within Josephus. The Gospels tell us that JB, I had to fit him in because I wanted him on that many lines, John the Baptist condemns the marriage to Herodias. In other words, saying that second marriage wasn't really valid, and that's why Herod executes John the Baptist. And then we look and see how Josephus links Herod's defeat by Aretas with his execution of John the Baptist. Now, if I'm just reading through Josephus, the story doesn't entirely make sense. But if I plug in that information from the Gospels, suddenly it all makes sense. Namely, that John the Baptist had opposed the marriage, the second marriage, and so it suddenly makes sense why people would link in their mind Herod killing John the Baptist with the defeat of his army. Now, what you see there is the way Josephus and the New Testament just dovetail in such a subtle way. You can't say that one's been written in order to supplement the other, because they're not really saying quite the same thing. Really, you say, this is what happens when two people independently report, not giving you all of the details, but they really do supplement each other. Another way we can look at the Gospels being reliable is the way they really do know the time and space. They know the geography. When we look at the Gospels, we see that they know lots of towns that were there. So they've got Jerusalem, which is the most famous town. It's actually the capital, and that's mentioned lots in the Gospels, but also lots of little villages, the ones near the bottom of this list. If you were living in some way off place, how would you know the names of little villages near Jerusalem or little villages in Galilee? People from around there would know them, but you couldn't go and get a book in Rome that would tell you about places like this, because they weren't on the list of places you need to visit before you die. So, who cares about Bethphage? But that is one of those places that's just known about in the Gospels. It's known exactly where it is. So that's a way that the Gospels show their knowledge of time and place. And that's not trivial, because remember back then, people didn't know very much about geography. Just look at ancient maps. Go and look at some ancient maps and look what weird shapes they have for countries. Because it's really hard, before you've got GPS and before you've got aeroplanes and things, to know what shapes things are. And so how accurate the Gospels are on geography, on traveling time, and how long it took to get from Galilee to Judea and so on, where the land goes up and down, that sort of knowledge is the sort of knowledge that people really would have if they're reporting reliably and not if they're making up stories somewhere else. But we can also say that when we look at the four Gospels, and they mention 12 to 14 towns each, a total of 23, we can say that they compare really favorably with the apocryphal Gospels. Like the Gospel of Philip has got two towns. One is Jerusalem, the other is Nazareth. And Jerusalem's the capital, so it's not a very impressive piece of knowledge. And Nazareth is a name very closely associated with Jesus. In fact, the Gospel of Philip seems to think that Nazareth is Jesus' middle name, which isn't very correct. So it's not very impressive, really. Then we look at some of our next Gospels, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of the Saviour. How many towns do they have? Well, they have precisely one, and that's Jerusalem, which is the capital, and therefore not very impressive. And then my next favourite, 13 early apocryphal Gospels. How many town names do they have? 0. So again, they're a good control sample. If you're going to test a drug, you might have one user group that uses the drug, another group that uses a placebo, and they're actually a control group, so you can see whether the drug really works. Well, I would say that the other Gospels are a great control group for showing what happens when people really make up stories. They just get the geography all wrong. They just don't know things. And the four Gospels do. Now, when we look at the number of words there are per Gospel, we see this pattern. I've given you in the 4 left-hand columns Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and how many words they have per Gospel. And in the 5 right-hand columns, I've given you how many words we have in 5 apocryphal Gospels: Philip, Thomas, Judas, Peter, and Mary. Peter and Mary are a bit too short there because they're only fragmentary Gospels. The whole manuscript doesn't survive. Maybe if they all survived, they would be somewhat longer. So you can see the 4 Gospels are slightly longer than the other ones. But let's just fix our eyes on those 4 left-hand columns, and I'm going to change the slide. That's the number of place names per Gospel. Number of words per Gospel, number of place names per Gospel, number of words per Gospel, number of place names per Gospel, number of words per Gospel, number of place names per Gospel. You got the idea, haven't you, by now? Do you want another one? Number of words per Gospel, number of place names per Gospel. So that when you ask the question, how many place names are there per 1,000 words, we find this. Apart from Peter, who's always a bit of an anomaly, Peters tend to be in life, because it's so short, we find the amazing statistic that all 4 Gospels have about 5 place names per 1,000 words. Not town names, place names, including places like Golgotha, which isn't a town but is a place. How do they get 5 place names per 1,000 words? Shall I tell you the answer? By not trying. By not trying. If you tried to put in place names in order to make a story sound authentic, one person would put in too many, one would try put in too few, because an artificial action isn't going to produce that. The idea that they could actually collude to do this is just impossible. In those days, firstly, they didn't use uppercase and lowercase letters. So finding where the place names are would be rather difficult. They also didn't have spaces between the words. So finding where the place names are would be rather difficult. Working out the total number of words in a document would be rather difficult. So any idea that anyone averaged out the number of words, did a sum, and tried to work it out so they all had the same proportion just won't work. This is a pattern you might just get if you don't try. If you do try, almost certainly you won't get it. It's the sort of thing that will happen if people just are simply reporting and they're all writing the same kind of literature. The same kind of literature is just recording naturally place names when it's relevant. And that's how you get a pattern like this. I'm not saying that proves that the records are authentic. I'm simply saying that a believer in the records, a believer that they've just been produced naturally, has an explanation for how you get this pattern. And someone who thinks that they've been produced artificially doesn't have a good explanation that I know of for how you produce this pattern. So it's not saying proof, it's saying there's an explanation if you believe, and there's not an explanation if you want to be skeptical. Let's look a little bit further at some internal criteria for believability. Again, this relates to place names. Let's take the proportion of the word Galilee to the word Judea. What we can see is that all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, refer to Galilee more than they do to Judea. Okay? And you'd expect that. I mean, they're writing about Jesus and his ministry in Galilee, so you're going to write about Galilee more, right? But what we find is, whereas they refer to Galilee more than Judea, what happens when we use the adjective? Actually, when we look at the adjective of Galilean and Judean, we find the opposite pattern. Apart from Luke, who has an opposite number of each, Matthew and Mark, and then John, who really uses the word Judean, which is like the word Jew, a lot, all three of those Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, have the word Judean overwhelmingly more than Galilean. So Galilee more than Judea, but Galilean less than Judean. How do you explain it? Well, I don't come into the sanctuary tonight and say, hey, I've just met a Texan, because the room is full of Texans. I know some of you aren't privileged to be Texans, and you have many people's deep sympathy. But the point is, the room is full of Texans, so I don't say I just went into the center of Houston and met a Texan, because the room's full of Texans. On the other hand, if you travel to France, and you said, and I went to France and I was in Paris and I met a Texan, that would make a lot of sense. Now, I know that Texans do talk about Texan quite a bit, so maybe that isn't the best illustration. But the basic idea that in a place, when you're from a place, on the whole, all other things being equal, there can be cultural factors that influence this, but you're less likely to talk about people as being identified as from that place, that makes sense. So this is exactly the sort of feature you'd expect if you've got Galilean writers. They don't tell you, I bumped into a Galilean, but they do talk about the Judeans, you see. This is exactly what you get. It's the sort of information that just implies something about the authors. It's internal criteria that can lead you to say, yeah, this is trustworthy. Or to give you another example, this is how you get information dovetailing. Just think about the feeding of the 5,000 and some of the ways information dovetails together. Firstly, we might ask the question, how do you count 5,000 men? According to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus fed 5,000 men and wives and children with 5 loaves and 2 fish, so not a lot. And it's one of those amazing things because it's actually mentioned in all 4 Gospels. Not many things are mentioned in all 4 Gospels. The Passion and Resurrection, but not even the birth narratives are mentioned in all 4 Gospels, but this one is. Well, what we find is there is some information about how you would count 5,000 people, and one of them is, of course, that Mark and Luke tell you about the groups. So in Mark, it says that they had them sit down by hundreds and by 50s, and in Luke, it says Jesus says to them, to the disciples, have them sit down in groups of 50. And it seems that some groups of 50 decided that they needed to huddle together and make groups of 100. So in other words, we've got some account that tells you about how they grouped. That means if you've got 12 disciples, they've only got about 8 groups each to count. That's pretty manageable, even for a fisherman and certainly for a tax collector. So in terms of counting, yes, you can get realistic numbers. You're not going to get realistic numbers when you just look out at a crowd and say, oh, 5,000. No, but when you divide them into groups, you can get accurate numbers. But what we find is that when we look at the feeding of the 5,000, it begins with the interesting detail that in Mark's Gospel, there was green grass there, and in John's Gospel, there was much grass. It doesn't tell you anything more about the grass. Is that just a detail put in to make the story look authentic, or is it actually true? Well, let's pass on that for the moment. But Mark's Gospel tells you that many people were coming and going, but doesn't exactly tell you why. But John's Gospel tells you it was Passover time. So if I put together that information, I suddenly make sense of it. That at Passover time, of course, many people have to come and go because they make pilgrimage to Passover. So if I put the information from John together with the information from Mark, suddenly I understand what's going on. Then we find in John's Gospel how Jesus turns to Philip, the disciple, and asks him where to buy bread. But he doesn't explain why he's asking Philip. And then we find a couple of verses later, Philip replies, and also Andrew replies. These are the two of Jesus' 12 disciples who have Greek names, by the way, Philip and Andrew. There's no one else, and they just happen to be mentioned here together. Now, Luke's Gospel doesn't tell you about that conversation, but it does tell you that the feeding took place near Bethsaida. And then if we go back to the beginning of John's Gospel, we find that Philip and Andrew were from Bethsaida. So you see the significance of this. If I'm reading through John's Gospel on its own, I see no reason why Jesus would turn to Philip and why Philip and Andrew would reply. But if I plug in the information from Luke, suddenly it makes sense that Jesus turned to a man with local knowledge and he replied, and another man with local knowledge also got involved in the reply. So in other words, this makes sense if they really are reporting what's true. And often what I think is going on with the Gospels is they have a whole range of true memory, lots of things they remember, and they're drawing on that deep well, and they're just reporting snippets. They could have reported far greater length. That's what it says in John's Gospel, that the whole world wouldn't be full of the books about Jesus, that there are many other signs you could record. There are so many things they could say about Jesus, but they're just drawing on a certain number. And then we find, even in John's Gospel, the little detail that the boy had barley loaves fits exactly with the time of Passover when you have therefore just had the barley harvest. But then you ask the question, but the grass, would the grass really have been green? Well, let's go to a precipitation chart from a nearby town, put in when the Passover would have been, and suddenly you find, yes, you've had 5 of the greatest months of rain leading up to that point. So would the grass have been green? You bet. So in terms of internal criteria, I think the Gospels do rather well. There's plenty of evidence that they are authentic. Next Sunday, Sunday after next, will be Palm Sunday. Just a simple story like that, where Jesus comes down the hill on the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem. Well, what evidence do we have? Mount of Olives, cursing a fig tree, palm branches. They know exactly the details of the botany. They know the shape of the land. And everyone's singing Hosanna, which is a quotation in Hebrew from Psalm 118, which is one of the things that you know from rabbinic sources that they were singing at exactly that time of year leading up to the Passover festival. So those sort of pieces of information just come together. They're all throughout the Gospels, pieces of information that are just really good quality knowledge. Someone making up a story a long way away just won't get right. Now let's come on to a 6th area of evidence, and that is the manuscripts for the Gospels. I can't prove everything historical. Manuscript evidence. Well, one line of argument that's been used, and it's a good line of argument, came from the British scholar F.F. Bruce, who was very involved with Tyndale House. And the argument went like this. When we look at classical scholars, we find that often they have very few manuscripts of their works. People like Tacitus, people like Caesar, and they trust their works. The New Testament manuscripts, on the other hand, are much more numerous than for most of the classical works. So if you accept the authenticity of classical literature, it's reasonable to accept the authenticity of New Testament literature. So if you accept one thing, you should accept 2. That's basically an argument for consistency. I like arguments for consistency. God seems to like arguments for consistency. He actually says in his judgment that he will use the standard that people have used on others on them themselves. It's an argument for consistency. And it's one of those things, if we are engaged in conversations with people who aren't Christians, the argument for consistency, for them to be consistent, is a really important one. If you're not a Christian here today, the argument I'd like to present to you is in terms of consistency, that you really are making sure you're being consistent how you judge something. So that's, I think, basically a sound argument. If you accept the classical texts and that they're basically authentic and that when you've got your penguin translation of a classical text, it really is a good translation or whatever, that's means, well, you should accept the authenticity of the New Testament. This argument does, however, allow you to reject everything. But, it's just a very high price to pay to say that, it's all a big conspiracy, all of the ancient classical works. On the other hand, sometimes the argument gets presented in a slightly corrupted way, which I want to warn you about because you will sometimes hear it. The argument goes like this: the New Testament has more manuscripts than any other work, so it wins. Now, the New Testament is authentic because it has more manuscripts. Now, can you see that's a rather different sort of argument? There are more copies, my friends, of USA Today than there are New Testament manuscripts. Does that mean USA Today is more reliable than the New Testament? No, there are more copies of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code than there are manuscripts of the New Testament. Do you see? So the argument from we've got a lot of them to reliability isn't fair. On the other hand, the argument from you accept this with this much evidence and we've got a lot more, that is a good argument. That's an argument for I'm just asking you to be consistent. You see, it's a very different thing. Sometimes people say to me, can you prove the New Testament hasn't changed? What they're asking me to do is to prove a negative. That's the same as proving that there isn't a pink elephant in the restroom that disappears every time I go in there. I can't do it. I can't prove that. I've got no reason to believe there is. I've got every reason to believe there isn't. So what I can do is say, I have got no reason to believe the New Testament's changed. We can trace back the manuscripts. There's no reason to think it's changed. Every reason to think it hasn't. So it's reasonable to trust. That's different from proving. None of the really important things in life can be proven. You cannot prove scientifically that your mother loves you. You can't. There's no scientific experiment you can do, and yet it's pretty important for most of us to believe that our mother loved us or loves us, isn't it? So really important things can't be proven like that. Some people say, I'm just a scientist. I just trust what science tells me. No. They've just mistaken who they are. Every scientist doesn't just trust science, they trust people. When they do their chemistry experiments, they probably send off to another lab and they trust their results. They get in chemicals and they trust that they really are the chemicals it says on the bottle. Whatever sort of experiment they're doing, they're relying on other people all of the time. They don't actually control every bit of the experiment. They're relying on other people doing their work. In other words, everyone is relying on persons. And when Christians commend trusting God to people, they are commending trust in a person. So there's no one in the world who isn't trusting a person. Do you know what happens to people who don't trust anyone? They starve because they can't eat any food, because they don't know anything on the tin hasn't been poisoned. And if they try and grow crops out of the ground, well, they're probably going to be trusting someone before who tells you that this seed is going to grow into that crop. Everyone is trusting someone all the time. Anyone who doesn't trust dies, right? So in other words, we've got to say to people, you are already trusting these people. We're asking you to be consistent. We've got so much reason to trust God. So let's stop talking about this silly proof stuff and trying to bring scientific proof arguments into discussions about what really matters in life. Science can't even do an experiment to show that science matters. There is no scientific experiment that tells you science matters. Science can't do experiments to show how much science should be funded. And if you can't do an experiment to show how much science could be funded and you only believe experiments, then you shouldn't fund science. So in other words, that idea that I only trust science just completely implodes. The people die and there's no funding for science. So you only can fund science and really thrive as humans when you begin to trust and assign value to things. And values don't come from scientific experiments. So I would want to say Christianity gives you a really good grounds for why you would have values, why you would believe you want to find out about the world. That's the sort of thing makes a lot of sense if you believe in a creator God. But actually, let's stop talking about this trying to prove or not prove, because there we're really setting the bar in completely the wrong place. So let's look at some of the evidence for the manuscripts in the New Testament. This is what's often thought to be the earliest fragment or part of a manuscript of the New Testament. It's actually in Manchester in the UK from the first half of the 2nd century. It's John chapter 18. And you can probably see across the top there's a bit of the margin at the top, and it's got writing on both sides. So we can actually work out exactly the wording it has, and it's found in southern Egypt. Well, the amazing thing is, John almost certainly wrote his gospel in western Turkey. And here, within a generation or two, we have a copy in southern Egypt, showing you just how far this spread, because every single copy back then had to be made by hand. Yes, printing was really only invented in the West in about 1450 or so, so everything had to be made by hand. If you got lots of copies, and presumably there were lots of copies because one of them's found its way to southern Egypt, then it's very hard to say it was all being made up. So you can compare that manuscript now with a modern translation, and you could say it's got exactly what you'd have in a modern translation. You can also look at other manuscripts. You can look at manuscripts which have the opening of John's Gospel from around the year 200. You can show manuscripts of the 4 Gospels, complete, in fact, the complete New Testament from the 4th century. You can also show translations of the Gospels. If anyone had wanted to change the Gospels, they can't just change it in one language. They have to change it in every language. And that's really a big logistical problem. I mean, just think about the budget you would need in order to forge the New Testament manuscripts. I mean, it would be absolutely huge by the time you bought all the boat tickets that you need to go to all the different places to forge all the manuscripts, swap out everyone's manuscripts. I mean, just how would you do it logistically? Here's another part, also of John chapter 18, this time in Oxford, UK, and showing you how you've got that. Well, with the manuscripts of the New Testament, they are better than classical works on the whole, although the numbers of Homer's Iliad is going up all of the time. So let's not think that the New Testament manuscripts always have to be more numerous than any other classical work. They're more numerous than most of the classical works, and that's just fine. And we can say that we've got 5,000 or 6,000 manuscripts in the New Testament. If I were to do away with 5,000 of those, I wouldn't have a really different New Testament. If I threw away the oldest manuscript, I wouldn't have a really different New Testament. In other words, our text of the New Testament in our Bibles doesn't depend on any one manuscript, any one group, doesn't depend on the Vatican, doesn't depend on any denomination. In fact, it's quite independent of that. That's why the New Testament is so solid. And if someone was going to change the New Testament, when would they change it? You see, if you're going to change it before Christianity takes over in the Roman Empire, before Constantine becomes emperor and converts to Christianity, the problem is this. The churches are divided, you've got poor communications, and Christianity is spread sometimes outside the Roman Empire, and they've begun to make translations. By the time you get to the Middle Ages, after Constantine, when there could be emperors and there could be popes who had a lot of power, the problem is Christianity has spread even further outside their domain, into even more languages that simply don't have any contact with. So the idea that there's been ever a point in history when there's been a really powerful person who can change the New Testament just doesn't work. Let's look finally at the question of what about other Gospels? Are there any other Gospels which should be deemed to be reliable? Well, let's go to a fictional British person, Sir Lee Teabing from the Da Vinci Code. This is what he says. Constantine, that's the Roman emperor in the 4th century, commissioned and financed a new Bible which omitted those Gospels that spoke of Christ's human traits and embellished those Gospels that made him godlike. The modern Bible was compiled and edited by men who possessed a political agenda to promote the divinity of the man Jesus Christ and to use his influence to solidify their own power base. So Christians have always been hungry for power, and that's what they were doing back then. The problem about Constantine choosing the Gospels is that from 100 years before Constantine, you can get a manuscript of the 4 Gospels. In Dublin, the Chester Beatty Papyrus, known as P45, Papyrus 45, has the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts, and it's from 100 years or so before the Great Council of Nicaea, before Constantine was born. So if Constantine made a Bible that decided what Gospels should be in and out, the problem is someone had already done it before he was born. And they did it at a time when Christians were being persecuted and there was no central religious power. Or here's another manuscript, just moved from to the Vatican from Geneva. Up here at the top is the end of Luke's Gospel. Just the title there is the end of Luke. There's another title just below, which is the beginning of John. And there you have it. Let's just blow that up for a minute. Here we can see the Gospel of John. And you can actually read. See that very first letter looks like a letter E? You see, in the next letter N? Can you see that? E-N? Anyone? E-N means in. N for in the beginning. Yeah? And the next letter is a letter A, R, C-H-E. It's like in like archaeology, in the beginning. It's all about things to do with beginning. It's easy to read this. This manuscript is from 100 years before Constantine, and guess what? It's got Luke, followed by John. So the idea that he chose the Gospels is rather problematic when I look at this manuscript. So I'd want to say, no, Constantine didn't choose the Gospels. Here's another person who would say the same. Irenaeus, that person we talked about, who is a disciple of John, says that having the 4 Gospels is like having 4 cardinal winds, 4 directions. It's something so basic to life. In fact, having the 4 Gospels was something not only that you have manuscripts in southern Egypt, which have the 4 Gospels, around the year 225. You've got this man in France, Lyon in France, having the 4 Gospels. You've got someone out in Syria called Tatian, around the year 175, who rolled the 4 Gospels into one continuous chronological narrative. So I've got France, Syria, and southern Egypt all having the 4 Gospels when there is no central Christian power over 100 years before Constantine's Great Council in Nicaea. So the idea that the 4 Gospels were chosen by political power is simply wrong. And we can also say that one of the things that's given a lot of support to this story about apocryphal Gospels was the discovery of 13 old leather manuscripts in the year 1945, and some of them in Egypt have things entitled Gospel. So this is manuscript number 2 of the 13, which was discovered in 1945. You can see the list of the contents of the manuscript. It's got something called the Gospel of Thomas and something called the Gospel of Philip. Well, that made people really excited. Wow, the Gospel of Thomas. Now, no one actually believes this is really written by Thomas, the disciple himself. But in the public conversation, that's not always clear. The scholars who like the Gospel of Thomas don't believe that Thomas wrote it. They simply like this Gospel and think it's as good, equally good, or equally bad with the other ones. That's what they believe. It's not that they think this is an inspired word of God. Well, this weird group from the 4th century who had this manuscript, they had one gospel called Gospel of Thomas and one gospel called the Gospel of Philip. And you can write a best-selling conspiracy theory book about those gospels. What you probably can't do is do a conspiracy theory book about the hypostasis of the archons. And the reason why is if you try and write a book, a bestseller, with the title The Hypostasis of the Archons, probably very few people will buy it. If you give it the title The Lost Gospel of Thomas, people go, whoa, the Lost Gospel of Thomas. I really want to know about that. If you say the lost hypostasis of the archons, they say, yeah. So you see what people do. They select bits of the manuscript and they bring them out and have how many radio programs and TV programs have been on the Gospel of Thomas? Gazillions. How many on the hypostasis of the archons? Probably 0. So what we find is there's a bit of selectivity. This is the opening of the Gospel of Thomas in the only complete manuscript to have it. And it doesn't survive in its original language, and it's got 114 sayings. And we're going to have a little look at it, just so you can see it's not very authentic. This is how it opens. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. Notice, these sayings are secret. So what the Gospel of Thomas is telling you is no one's ever heard of this before. It's a secret. If you really want to know the true story of Jesus, you need to come to Thomas. Because Jesus had 12 disciples, but he only let Thomas in on the secret. So what you can't do is say we've got 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm going to stick a 5th Gospel, Thomas, alongside it. Because the Gospel of Thomas is telling you the other ones are wrong. You really need to get in on the secret message. So it's pretty noticeable that what it's about is secret knowledge. And this is how it begins. And he said, that's Jesus said, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. In other words, the way you get to be saved is by getting knowledge. This is what's called knowledge or gnostic. The word gnostic with a silent G, gnostic, just comes from the word gno, to know something. Okay, it's really the same word. And they were a group that really emphasized secret knowledge. And guess what? Their message is pretty obvious. You need the secret knowledge. Now, this is not authentic. It's from much later. It's probably from the 2nd century as a writing, and the first copy we have, complete copy, is from the 4th century. There's no reason to put this alongside the 4 Gospels, which are not secret Gospels. The 4 Gospels are Gospels which were publicly proclaimed. They're not saying they have anything to hide. They're the sort of things that you can investigate. Let's look at another Gospel. I'm going to miss out the Gospel of Philip. This is the text, Gospel of Philip, from which you get the talk about Jesus' wife. Let's look briefly at that. Again, this is Sir Lee Teabing. And the companion, he says, reading from the Gospel of Philip, supposedly, of the Saviour is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth. The rest of the disciples were offended by it and expressed disapproval. They said, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" The word surprised Sophie, who is the French girl in the fictional story, The Da Vinci Code. And yet they hardly seemed conclusive. "It says nothing of marriage," she said. "Au contraire," Teabing smiled, pointing to the first line. As any Aramaic scholar will tell you, the word companion in those days literally meant spouse. Now, why you would ask an Aramaic scholar what a Greek word in a Coptic text meant, I'm not sure, but maybe his research assistant was away at that time. But where does that bit in the Gospel of Philip come from? I'm going to show you a bit of, this is a Coptic text. Can anyone read Coptic? Great. Where does it come from, the bit about Jesus' wife? Where on this page? Can anyone hazard a guess where on the page it comes from? The bit that's missing. Yes, exactly. It comes from right there. And what the text really says is, and blank, companion of the blank, Mary Magdalene blank, used to blank more than the disciples blank, used to greet her blank, times the rest blank blank. They said, "Why do you love her more than all the rest of us?" Well, that's a bit different. But that is the manuscript basis on which the idea that Jesus had a fling with Mary Magdalene rests. The other bit that people have tried to make a noise about, there was a Harvard professor, Karen King, talking about the Gospel of Jesus' wife, which is almost certainly a forgery. Then there's the Gospel of Judas. This is the manuscript of the Gospel of Judas, the only manuscript in the world of the Gospel of Judas, and this is one of the better looking pages. Thankfully, it has lambda delta in Greek, which means page 34, which can tell you a certain amount about how long the manuscript was. This is how the Gospel of Judas begins. Let's get the beginning, because I think it will sound familiar. The secret account of the revelation that Jesus communicated with Judas Iscariot during a week, 3 days before he celebrated the Passover. Now, what's familiar is it says it's a secret account. In other words, if you want to know the real story of Jesus, you have to go to the Gospel of Judas. Haven't we heard that before? That's just what the Gospel of Thomas was saying. But you can't put the Gospel of Thomas alongside the Gospel of Judas because they're each claiming to be the really authentic secret account. There's only one secret account. So you can't just keep on adding up all these Gospels. There wasn't a sort of whole range of Gospels that people were choosing between. No, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas make exclusive claims. They say they're the only true account. Jesus only let one disciple into his secret. But when did Judas write this account? He wrote it using that unusual phrase, a week, 3 days before he celebrated the Passover. Well, guess what? When I read the Gospels in the New Testament, I read that Jesus had that Passover and that Satan entered Judas 2 days. And it seems to be copying that. In other words, it's looked at the Gospels, seen about the bit that happens 2 days before, and it said, oh, let's give them a bit of time to write a Gospel, or make it 3 days before. So in other words, this isn't independent of the Gospels, this is copying from the Gospels. So this is part of the evidence for the Gospels. So I'd want to say in all of these ways, the apocryphal Gospels aren't a threat to the four Gospels. The apocryphal Gospels give us loads of evidence for the four Gospels, both in showing what happens when people make stories up and in showing us just how different the portraits they have are from what would happen in the first century. So I wouldn't say we should prefer the apocryphal Gospels. Why can we trust the Gospels? Well, I've given you 7 reasons. Let's just recap those. We know roughly when they're written. There's corroboration for what they say. They're embarrassing. They know what the places they're writing about. They've got internal evidence in terms of patterns, good manuscript evidence, and they stand up well against other so-called Gospels. There are other reasons which I could share with you, but we will not end our meeting tonight at 10:30. Thank you very much for listening, and question time, you.